to the third webinar in the SEG Latin America Regional Advisory Committee's webinar series, A Path to a Career in Geophysics. Dr. Sergio Chavez Perez, Chair of the Latin America Regional Advisory Committee, and myself, Lori Whitesell, will serve as your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, the model for this webinar will be a short presentation followed by a question and answer session. During the question and answer session, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand in the webinar interface, and I will adjust your settings so that you can ask your questions directly to the presenter. Nancy House, a member of SEG for 39 years, has worked as a geophysicist for multinational corporations and small independent oil companies, primarily as an interpreter in on and offshore plays in the U.S., South America, West and East Africa, to name a few areas. She currently is the owner of Integrated Geophysical Interpretations, Inc. in Littleton, Colorado. So without further ado, please welcome Nancy House.
Good morning. I'm going to tell you about how I ended up as a geophysicist and ultimately president of SEG. So this is one of my favorite places in the whole world. It exhibits extreme geology. This is Heart Mountain in Wyoming, where the very tip of this mountain is several hundred million years older than what's below it. It's been in place there in some mysterious way, which always helped to drive my curiosity. So I was born in Cody, Wyoming, and that picture was taken, you can see Heart Mountain from Cody. My father was a geologist, and here you see him explaining geology to a bunch of Girl Scouts 2 years before I was born. Then shortly, when I was about 4 years old, he packed us all up, and my mother took us to Cochabamba, Bolivia, where he was working as an exploration geologist for what eventually became Tenneco Oil. He was in the Army during World War II, and my mother was in the Waves. So they were both veterans and very happy to have a blessed life in Wyoming. I attended the University of Wyoming, eventually majoring in geology with an intention to go into geophysics. My previous life as an expat family in South America and Singapore is where I met my first geophysicist friends who encouraged me to look into geophysics as I was interested in physics. I graduated from the University of Wyoming thinking that somebody was going to encourage me and pay for me to go to graduate school, and was mostly pretty non-committal and hoping somebody would tell me what to do with my life in interviews, and consequently didn't get a job offer. So I decided to go to a fairly practical applied geophysics school, of which there were two that were recommended to me. One, Colorado School of Mines in Golden, and the other, University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Somebody also suggested that I go to Johns Hopkins, and when I asked where that was, and he said Baltimore, I thought there's no way you can go from this to Baltimore. So I ended up deciding to go to Colorado School of Mines, and ended up getting a master's degree in 1979. While I was there, there were close to 100 graduate students in geophysics, because it was the beginning of the big boom of the 1980s. And so it swelled the ranks of geophysics department, but there weren't very many women in it. In fact, I rolled in and I was the co-ed, and that's how I spent most of my times being recruited as, oh yes, we have one, we have a co-ed. Like I say, it never really hurts to dream. By the time I was about 9 years old, I had a picture of in my head of being a scientist and making some profound discovery that even though I wasn't the smartest crayon in the box, I felt that I could see something that other people couldn't. You can go ahead and afford to do things that may seem a little bit outside of it. You don't have to be serious all the time. So here I am in the junior follies. Family is important. That's my sister, and we maintain a relationship today. And you can even see the kind of more reserved personalities versus the more gregarious ones. And it's always important to keep your friendships up and keep those ties up through your life. As I said, I really loved physics. And we had it in high school and it was taught by a physicist. I got an NSF scholarship to the University of Wyoming with the intent to improve the caliber of science teaching in the U.S. secondary schools. As I said before, the lifestyle of an expat geologist in South America, it gave me a sense of the people, other cultures, and how the world gets along. Here's some of my science grades in the elementary school. I was always really good in the academic part. Sometimes it looks like my conduct left a little bit to be desired, but that meant that I was always having fun in those classes. So when I did eventually graduate from mines as the girl, there were job offers abounding, and it was unfortunately related to my gender, as there was equal employment opportunity laws had been passed, and companies were required to have a certain proportion of their professional ranks as women. So in order to actually have one who did have the qualifications, at least on paper, was very attractive to those companies. So I would say this gave me quite an edge, and it's important to remember that and to recognize that you may be given the opportunity, but it's up to you to fulfill it. There was career and family. There were lots of fun runs and activities you could get into and work as in addition to working. It's always good to have teams and competitions and work. And here I am actually pregnant with my second child. As I was saying, the equal employment opportunity was critical in my being given, I would say, additional opportunities. And those still had to be made lucrative by me. It just prevented discrimination. It didn't give you anything more. It was always important for me to look for mentors and coaches and bosses and colleagues that I could work with and learn from, and important to learn from them. A lot of times there were special arrangements that had to be made in the field for ladies, and some companies had special clubs that were men exclusive and sororities for women that did different things. And this one I did have an issue with, because it meant that I didn't have equal access to the managers, because I wasn't playing pool and having beer with them. I was supposed to be doing social programs in the community, in the sorority. This industry is up and down. The boom lasted from about 1979 and kind of fell off the cliff in mid-1986. And many companies went from hundreds of geophysicists to handfuls of geophysicists in a period of 18 months. And it was pretty much devastating. But the one this time, I believe, may be even worse, because at the time, there were 10 to 15 major integrated oil companies, and often you could go from one to the other. So essentially, Mobile had a vision in 1988, and they determined that the workforce of 2000 and beyond was going to be much more diverse than what they had seen in the past. And they set out specifically to recruit and hire fully qualified professionals that were minorities and women. And they actively recruited, at least from Phillips Petroleum, 3 of the women that became very prevalent within Mobile in a few years. And I was among those. I eventually was not named one of the 2 emerging technical leaders in Mobile. I had wonderful job assignments. I had 3 transfers in 6 years, which did eventually take a toll on my marriage. It ended in divorce. There were children's illnesses to deal with. Single parenthood was not trivial, but we all worked together. When the merge over occurred between Mobil and Exxon in 2000, I had made that decision once before, and the closer it got, the more I felt that I needed to pursue other opportunities. So I came back to Colorado School of Mines to work on a PhD, which I didn't complete because at the time that I was in school, my children were preparing to go to college, and I needed to earn enough income for that, and also to get them launched and out. But what the 2 years at Colorado School of Mines did is it prepared me for re-entry into the career with new skills and new abilities. So those skills were multifold. I went back to the University of Wyoming, or to School of Mines, wondering why it was always so difficult to encourage management to spend money on technology like seismic. Like this project that I worked in Peru, in the Amazon, eventually ended up costing a consortium of companies over $200 million. And it taught me very definitively that as an explorationist, if you are suggesting to spend hundreds of millions of dollars or even millions of dollars on purchasing data, it's really important that you be able to communicate and understand what that data is worth. And that was one of the main topics of my return. It was to mines. I was studying not only geophysics, but importantly, reservoir engineering and mineral economics. And the economics part was what really enabled me to communicate to management the value of investing several $1 million in seismic, time in getting reprocessing so that you could pull additional attributes out of your seismic data. And when I walked in the field of borehole microseismic and microseismic monitoring for hydraulic fracture mapping was just emerging, and it was being used, and I got the opportunity to use it and fall into it. And it's become a very important part of the unconventional revolution. So this is what I'm calling economic intelligence, and it really is important to have that, because most of the people that you need to convince as a geophysicist to invest in your technology don't understand that technology. And what they need more than anything is to understand, what is this going to do for the company? What is this going to do for the bottom line? And how important is it that I invest in this, and what would it look like without it? The other part that I really learned and helped me along is this engineering, understanding that when I'm asking somebody to put a $2 million tool down their borehole to monitor microseismic or to do a VSP, that I not only have to understand what the risk is to that tool if it gets stuck in their hole, but actually what that means to them in terms of it costs them so much money to drill that borehole. It's going to be money coming out eventually. And if they have a $2 million very hardy tool in there, it's going to cost a lot more than the tool to them if I have put something in there that damages it. So these were learnings that were pretty critical to me in the second part of my career. So eventually, through several years at Encana, I was asked to come and show Chevron how to do unconventionals by setting up their program in the Marcellus. I became chief geophysicist of Exco Resources, which was heavily involved in unconventional resources. And then the downturn hit, and as happened to many people, companies realized or felt that geophysics was a luxury that they could afford, that they could not afford any longer. So my whole department was let go, and I chose to come back to Colorado and form integrated geophysical interpretation with the intent to offer geophysical knowledge and even, I'm going to call it infrastructure, and that is the ability to plan, execute, and deliver to management interpretations of geophysical data so that they can act upon it and understand the value immediately without a lot of additional, and I'm going to just call it infatuation with the process. As geophysicists, we tend to really appreciate the technology that we're delivering, and sometimes that enthusiasm is not appreciated by the people who are our customers. So what the intent of this company is to do is to offer a product for investors and small enterprises which incorporates the economics, the engineering, along with the high-level geophysical interpretation, and offer them the ability to use it on a very small scale in their particular area. Then you get into understanding and helping them to understand why some of their wells are doing better than others. And you can start to correlate that with certain things that come out of your seismic information. And this is becoming more and more the realm of statistics and artificial intelligence, machine learning. But it doesn't happen without a very solid grounding in your science, along with an understanding of what each one of these dots represents. And here we're trying to understand the relationships between lateral length and productivity. And what you see is some of the long ones are pretty poor, but some of the long wells are very, very highest producers. So your science in geophysics could be used to unravel if there's a difference in the reservoir there. So that sort of concludes, that's where I am right now. I'm providing integrated geophysical interpretation services to any companies or even data owners, and also doing a pretty heavy-duty volunteer job for the next few months. Are there any questions?
I guess I'll start, Nancy. I have a question.
All right.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about how some of the challenges presented working in the Amazon?
Oh, that was so fun. that was the pinnacle of my career. You know, most of the challenges working in the Amazon were social and environmental. And that meant that as a world-class integrated oil company, there was a lot of challenges to our activities in the rainforest. And what you see in this picture is two of our environmental consultants. And we were out there with one of the anthropologists from the Discovery Channel. Well, he's made several Discovery Channel photographs or videos. And he was quite concerned about how bringing 600 men seismic crews into the Amazon. For both of these blocks that we worked, there was at least 3.5 years of preparation, dissemination of environmental impact studies. One time, and it was the early 1990s, and word processing was becoming very kind of mainstream. And in one of the original impact statements, the preparer had left the river name from a previous document in portions of the report. And while we understand that that mistake was really a trivial word processing mistake, when it was presented and made public, that small error cost us 18 months in trying to gain the trust and enable us to go do that work. So the requirements were quite stringent in the end. The seismic crew, which there were 2, and they consisted of approximately 600 men, and they were not allowed to live off the jungle. They weren't allowed to feed themselves through hunting. They had to remove all waste that they took in with them, except for, some biodegradable waste. And they were strung out over 10 million hectares. It was blocks about half of a basin size. They were gigantic blocks. So just the logistics of that were extremely complex. We had environmental monitors along each and every seismic line in the jungle. And also we had observers from Conservation International, because while a seismic line that is straight in the jungle is non-random for our purposes, it's extremely random if you are doing biologic surveys through the jungle. So we would have one biologist and I think an anthropologist along with each and every line cutting crew through the rainforest. And the line cuttings, they call them trench cuttings or line cuttings. But that was really men with machetes that went along with the surveyors, and they surveyed in every point. And there were very strict limits on how large a tree could be cut. The other big scientific study that was conducted was that what was the best way to reforest helipads, because you could see helipads in the rainforest from satellite images that had been taken in the 1980s when earlier seismic lines were acquired. And so we had biologists and botanists along our lines as well who were studying what's the best way to reforest those helipads. The other thing that was really critical, and we watched this in some of the rainforests in Ecuador, is it wasn't the initial entry into the rainforest that was damaging to it, but eventually the fact that people had been able to get that deep into the rainforest and come back and had survived and could recognize that there were resources out there. So what you would see on the satellite images was a great deal or later, you would see homesteading and deforestation along the previous seismic lines. So we had to be extremely careful to mitigate that as much as possible by disguising where the seismic lines were in terms of coming into and out of the rivers, which were the major access point. So it was very, very challenging from an environmental standpoint. There was an area along one of the foothills programs where unregulated gold mining was occurring, and they were using mercury as a catalyst to help separate the gold. So here you had the oil companies with all these regulations and the unregulated miners who were using raw mercury and touching it and introducing it into the ecosystem. So at one of the town meetings, when we were presenting one of the early drafts of our environmental impact statement, one of the priests asked me why, in Spanish, why we didn't just go look for the oil where the gold miners were already destroying the environment. And my response seemed a little flip, but there was actually a great deal of truth in it, where I told him that maybe as a priest, he had better connections to God than I did, but I didn't have that knowledge and that ability. I didn't know where the oil was. I could only go where I felt it was most likely to be. So, that probably was one of the most challenging aspects of that whole program. But in the end, we had Glenn Shepard out at our Foreland base camp for a week, observing and watching what we were doing. When I dropped him off in Cusco, he looked at me and he said, I don't want to say this, but in some ways I hope that mobile stays, because they are demonstrating a concern for the environment now and in the future. And that might not be what happens if other entities come in. Thank you for asking that question. That's my funnest question.
Okay, well, we have another question from Gustavo, and I just unmuted him, so he should be able to ask the question directly.
Hi, Nancy. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for a very nice presentation. I would like to hear you a little bit about the importance of professional associations in your life.
That's a very good question. Professional associations have been integral in terms of expanding my knowledge. I can remember being a geophysicist in Denver in the early 80s, and some of the most applicable courses were when SEG would come through with their distinguished short course and give us a tutorial on something fundamental that you might not have learned in school in the depth that you need it. So I have a number of workbooks and notes, class notes from early distinguished short courses that were put on by my local society, the Denver Geophysical Society, and also by the SEG as they would come through with their distinguished short course and distinguished lectures. So the ability for me to look to SEG and my local societies for continuing education and collaboration with other geophysicists, because once you're in a company, there's a limit to what you can discuss, but our technology is something that isn't proprietary for the most part, unless you're working on something extremely new. So that's the important role that they played early in my career. Then later on, going to the annual meetings and getting on to some of the committees, that became extremely integral too. It put me in touch with people from other parts of the world, and you could actually see what the challenges were in the Middle East versus what I was facing in Latin America or the mountains in the Rocky Mountains. So did that answer the question?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, actually, I have another question for you, Nancy. You've already mentioned that, you've worked in different areas around the world, and a lot of geophysicists do the very same thing. They work in one area, portion of their career, and then they go to another. So when you were working in the Amazon in Latin America, most geophysicists, they speak English more or less well. The question is, did your company provide you, or was it encouraged to learn how to speak Spanish prior to arriving in the Amazon?
Actually, they did, and this was very beneficial. I did have a strong foundation in Spanish, having lived there, and that's part of the reason that it was very thrilling and the very one of my career highlights is to be allowed to speak or to work in the Amazon. But as soon as I joined that team, they provided Spanish lessons at lunchtime 3 days a week at a variety of levels. So some of my most fond memories are sitting through Spanish classes at Mobil Oil trying to translate the Dobrin Applied Geophysics textbook and discussing whether or not a screen is a pantalla or not. So they did not only encourage, and it's usually part of the application, and it should be on your resume if you speak fluently, read, write, and are familiar with languages. So that is something, if you are working a location where you need another language, at the time at least, companies were very encouraging to help you learn that language so that you were able to communicate.
Thank you. One more. As someone who's worked extensively around the world for different large and small companies, and now as a business owner, if there was one thing that a newer student should try to get experience on and knowledge of before they graduate, is there any one particular skill set that you think that they should have as we move forward?
In addition to knowing your trade very well and being open to, I would guess, and being somewhat humble. I know I was not, right when I came out of school. I was large and in charge, and how dare they expect me not to know this. But communication, and it sounds like an easy term to apply, but writing emails, and this is one of my weaknesses. I tend to send them before I read them 3 or 4 times. But being able to communicate an idea in a way so that people who are unfamiliar with your science can understand it. And that's written, verbal, and when you're trying to communicate a concept in terms of what this technology will do to solve the problem at hand, and what visual demonstration does there need to be of this technology.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions for Nancy House? All right. Well, I think There are no more questions. Got off easy. So thank you, Nancy, and thank all of you for attending the SEG Latin America Regional Advisory Committee's webinar as part of our webinar series, A Path to a Career in Geophysics. Please respond to your webinar follow-up email and let us know what you liked, what could be done better, and suggestions, please, for future webinar topics. So please look out for our social media posts to register for next month's interesting talk from Terrell DePaul on the 23rd of August. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and thank you very much, Nancy, for presenting a very interesting story.
And thank you, and I apologize for being late. It's just that you get stuck with your technology of having a meeting on your calendar.
No problem. I know you're a very, very busy woman.
Okay, thank you all.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.